good evening, ladies and gentlemen, all those of you present and all those of you following remotely via our webcast, video webcast. I'm really delighted to welcome tonight Gustav Gressel, who's sharing with Mozart the happy specificity of being born in Salzburg and having studied partly there, having also had a number of responsibilities. Then, after his master's in political science at Salzburg University, and after getting another master's at the military academy, Theresianische Military Academy in Vienna, and then the beginning of his career was marked by responsibilities, you might call them as officer, analyst, expert, in particular at the Austrian Defense Ministry regarding strategic and security matters. And then after a PhD that he received, he became a researcher. He's now filling this role of senior fellow to the Berlin office of the European Council for Foreign Relations, which you know very well. It's a very well-recognized institution, and they have an office in Paris, and we work with them very regularly. We're really happy to welcome him tonight with, of course, an extremely important topic, because it's about the issue of the Ukraine conflict, the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, and what it means for future changes in the equilibria on our continent, changes in European military policy. He will come back to that. It's true that also we're at a moment when this conflict is crystallizing. It's been through several steps, and this is a rather difficult moment. Difficult because as they have to hold the front line against Russia, Ukrainian forces are having a hard time because they lack sufficient support, and the blocked decision at the US Congress and European difficulties regarding their undersized production facilities, given the need to deliver the expected ammunition, the thaw, the spring, the fact that a Russian offensive might start again, and also issues regarding weapons deliveries and recent discussions in Berlin between the German Chancellor, the French President, and the Polish head of state. All of that, I'm sure, are so many topical matters that will probably feed the questions that you'll have for him, which he very gladly agreed to answer. I'll remind you of the rules. Dear Gustav, you'll have as long as it takes for your insightful presentation, because I saw the abstract, very well substantiated. I won't reveal anymore. And then if you agree, we can have a debate together. And then more widely, we always save some time for questions from the floor, always starting with students and then the free listeners and the guests following this round of lectures. Vielen Dank, lieber Gustav, dass Sie diese Konferenz heute Abend halten, akzeptieren haben. Und jetzt. Of course, there's a problem, because I can see that our interpreters do not translate German, but you didn't need any translation. These were a few kind words to tell him that it was time to start.
For not speaking proper French. I should have learned it in the military academy, but the only effect it had back then was that it overlaid my Spanish, and I continued to confuse both, and at the end speak none. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear online visitors, it is a great pleasure to have you here and to talk a bit about the topic, how this war might end or not. Before I start my explanation, I have to make a slight confession and a bit of an excuse. When I got the invitation, I scratched my head and oh my God, it's of course very honorable to be invited to such a prestigious university, but I will go to Ukraine soon for another trip. How do I do that? And my wife said, Gustav, you can't say no to the Sorbonne. You cannot say. And you know, as a soldier, the French, the former French Prime Minister Clemenceau once said, a woman should be glad to marry a soldier. Not only can he cook and knit and sew, first and foremost, he knows to obey. So I'm here. You can either thank or curse my wife. But of course, after the confession, it's a hugely complex and complicated topic. And at the beginning, I thought, oh my God, I can't talk. It's such an elusive topic. I can't talk about how the war ends because it probably won't for the foreseeable future and the foreseeable years. And then when I slept over it, I thought, maybe just because of that, actually, one should talk about it. So the possible end of the war in Ukraine at the time being is mostly up to speculations. And these speculations, unfortunately, have some political relevance because as the head of the SPD, for example, in last week's debate about Taurus missiles said that we now need to think about freezing the war. There is a lot of wishful thinking involved in possible discussions or discussions on a possible end of the war. For the time being, as it is still a dichotomous event. So it can be either one or the other solution. Either Russia wins militarily or Ukraine wins militarily. Russia, for the time being, seems to be closer to that moment, depending on Western support, depending on the fate of the US elections in autumn, which not only the presidential, but also the legislative elections to Congress and Senate, might allow Russia to win this war by 2025. That's a fairly early date. For Ukraine to win this war, it would need increased and continuous military support by the West, and then it could win once Russia's military apparatus has exhausted its resources of material. And this will happen if you're an absolute optimist by 2026, but I guess by 2028 it will actually become likely. A truce of exhaustion in between these two dates is theoretically possible, but practically very unlikely. Why? Well, let's digress into things. Let's explore first the Russian war aims. Russia overall started the war. What are they fighting for? If you go back into Russian foreign policy concepts, even the first one, Putin issued as a prime minister, but even older ones going back to the Yeltsin times, you basically see three basic steps or stages. One, to improve the industrial, financial, technological base that Russia is working with, to modernize Russia. For that, they need some sort of accommodation with the West. The second stage, to reintegrate the territories of the former USSR. And this started long before Putin with various discussions about the Commonwealth of Independent States and how it should be organized and what should be the exact competences of it, on which not. But of course, with Putin, it took a much more energetic and violent turn. And three, if you have completed stage 1 and 2, to reinstate Russia as a great power. This has been camouflaged around a lot of other debates about multipolarity, about the just world order. That's a Chinese term for the same thing. But it is important, if we conceptualize what Russia wants out of this war, to know that these three things are integrated. Russia's foreign policy that tries to achieve them and tries to bring Ukraine back into Russian control is quite old. And its political interference into Ukrainian domestic affairs to secure that is also quite old. Basically, we can track it to day one of Ukraine's independence and the attempts to prevent the independence of Ukraine, because the independence of the Baltic countries did disturb the Soviet Union, but the independence of Ukraine ended the Soviet Union. Then basically the Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, once it was clear that these countries were divorced, that the Soviet Union had ended. We can trace it back to the continuous negotiations about the Black Sea Fleet and how it was used to gain a foothold in Ukrainian policies that were concluded with the 1997 Black Sea Fleet Treaty. We can trace it back to the Orange Revolution, where Russia was caught cold-handed in its attempt to falsify the elections in favor of Viktor Yanukovych. We have then the 2006 gas crisis. We have a permanent propaganda war, subversion, payment of local actors in Ukraine to work on the behalf of Russia, a spy war between the countries that, of course, on the Russian side made use of a lot of weaknesses and institutional weaknesses of the Ukrainian side. And then, of course, 2014, the first military escalation between the two countries with the occupation of Crimea and then with the occupation of Donbass. The first Minsk agreement that followed in September 2014, the second Minsk Accord of February 2015, the first two ceasefires that did not end the war. As a consequence of the Minsk II process alone, Ukraine and Russia held more than 200 contact rounds to negotiate the exact terms of an implementation of the treaty, and had 20 different and independent ceasefire agreements between the two parties. All of them, of course, led nowhere. The Russian interpretation of the Minsk agreement was that Minsk granted Russia a foothold in Ukrainian domestic politics. Russian delegations would often arrive in Minsk negotiation rounds with ready formulated legislative texts they demanded Ukraine to implement as demanded by Russia in order to grant the Russian proxy regimes that it had erected on the Russian soil a de facto constitutional status and enforce a quasi-federalization of Ukraine. Ukraine, on the other hand, perceived the Minsk agreement as an agreement that at the end would lead to reintegration of the Donbass. The escalation and the more blunt formulation of Russian war aims came then in 2021, when in summer Putin published his article about the historical unity of Ukrainian and Russian people. And basically he described Ukraine as an accident of history that should have never have happened, and the reversing of this accident of history would be the key Russian foreign policy goal that needs to be taken care of. And if you look into all of Putin's larger speeches, things like when he recognized the so-called People's Republics, when he declared war on Ukraine, the speeches of the annexation of the occupied territories, his speech before the All-Russian Assembly in November last year, which was also quite a revealing speech. His speech to the State of the Nation, his newest speeches, all of them reiterate that Ukraine should not exist, and that Russians and Ukrainians are one, and they need to fulfill that in practice. And that, of course, translates then into the two declared war aims that Russia has in its war. This is denazification, under quotation mark, and demilitarization. Denazification means to eradicate the intellectual, political, journalistic, security elites of Ukraine, those who support an independent Ukraine. And demilitarization means to make the country vulnerable to Russian pressure and military aggression in order to enforce any later demands by military means. And especially on denazification and on sort of erasing the Ukrainian nation, if you look into the practices of of Russia as an occupying power, you see that unfolding, not only the euphemistic naming of these camps as filtration camps, where you filter out elements that you don't want to keep in society. The enforced mobilization on occupied territories to pull away men and send them to quite suicidal jobs on the front, that basically breaks the lineage of male population in the occupied territories. There's no other territory in the Russian Federation that has a so high degree of people mobilized for war than the occupied territories in Ukraine, particularly DNR, LNR. You see this genocidal intent also in how sexual violence against women and children is perpetrated by Russian soldiers. There's numerous accounts of Russian soldiers raping women and especially raping children in order to discourage them from having any further sexual intercourse, not to have kids. You don't want the enemy people to have kids because you don't want them to repopulate. In the occupied areas, if you speak Ukrainian, you might disappear the next day. There are people arbitrarily shot because it is suspected that they might wait for the Ukrainian army, or they might have hidden symbols of the Ukrainian state in their home. So this kind of policy is implemented. And it shows the amount of radicalization that the Russian war aims and the Russian post-Soviet policies has undergone in the last decade. But it also shows us that Russian war aims are more about their own identity than about Ukraine. And they are more about identity and irrational factors such as history, how to deal with history, than tangible, negotiable objects like security, transparency, trust-building measures, disarmament, etc. You can negotiate about the latter ones, but it's hard to negotiate about identity. If the Russian elite, and it's not only Putin alone, if the Russian elite are suffering from a Versailles syndrome, that they think their nation cannot exist without having control over territories that now belong to another state because they were once part of your state, it is very hard to cast that into rational demands. And this makes negotiations extremely difficult. And then last but not least, I would remind back to the third stage of Russian foreign policy, the issue of great power. If you go back to December 17th, 2021, when Russia put a proposal for security assurance measures on the table, they sent it to the United States and to NATO, then you basically get a formal glimpse of what actually it means, what kind of order Russia would mean. It is a prohibition of especially security relations by NATO to countries that Russia perceives in their sphere of influence, a rollback of the NATO enlargement de facto, because you withdraw all the military assets, a withdrawal of US nuclear weapons from Europe in order to make Europe more dependable and blackmailable. Conquering Ukraine is not the end goal, but it is, in Moscow's point of view, the most important cornerstone of making Russia a great power again. A Russia that at a later point needs to fight to conquer 80% of Ukraine is a regional power. A Russia that has conquered Ukraine and dominates Europe militarily is a global power. As I said, Russia works very, very long on all of these three agendas. But by signing a ceasefire or freezing the conflict, by retracting from their maximalist goals, Moscow would basically seize its long-standing, not only identity goals, but its long-standing foreign policy goals of making Russia a great power again. And I don't see that Putin or somebody else in the Kremlin is really willing to do so. Now, let's switch side. look at Ukrainian war aims, the Ukrainian war aims, of course, are first and foremost survival. But survival needs to be operationalized. Survival has a security dimension to be sure that you are able to withstand a further Russian aggression or an attempt of Russia to fight the war again in a couple of years. And this is actually the most pressing issue that Ukrainians have. If you talk to Ukrainians, and not only politicians, but normal people on the street, what they think of the war and what should be Ukrainians' sort of end state. They say, well, we need to fight this war now so that our children will not have to fight the same war when they're old. Now, of course, humble people on the street can't operationalize when sort of what kind of security conditions need to be met for Russia not to challenge their kids in 20 or 25 years. But this is sort of the general desire for Ukrainians in the war, and that is shared pretty much across society. So it means having the right to maintain its armed forces, at best, integration into Euro-Atlantic security structures, because that would increase immediately the costs for Russia trying to make another attempt at subjugating Ukraine. And of course, economic sustainability, being in a state where Ukraine has an independent economy integrated in market structures that are not controlled by Russia and cannot be leveraged by Russia against it, having access to export routes, having access to the Black Sea, etc. Territory. Territory is a very important dimension in Ukrainians' definition of what the end state should be, because Ukraine has made this experience that Russian-controlled territories of Ukraine are the perfect springboard for further military aggression. They want, at best, no DNR, LNR, or any kind of construct on their soil that would allow Russia to have, or entitle Russia for the job of protecting someone in the country. They also have made the experience that Crimea is an important springboard, not only for a land invasion, but especially for air and missile attacks. They're bombed basically from Crimea every day and every night. And that every gray zone, a zone where sort of lawlessness persists, would be used, or that status is not really clear, will be used to harm Ukraine at a later stage. Ukrainians also know that there is no West German solution for them. There's a lot talked about sort of Ukraine in the West, that can't you have a West German solution? You will reunite with the occupied areas when Putin is dead and the Russians have come to terms with the fact that they're probably this was a dumb idea to start the war in the first place. The problems Ukrainians have with that is that they know that there will be no Ukrainian East Ukraine, like there was in East Germany, that was still an East Germany, because the curriculums are changed, the youth is brainwashed, kids are deported to Russia, the cultural heritage, you see museums emptied and artifacts brought out. So the whole Ukrainian identity of the people that still stayed is destroyed, and Russia brings in new settlers to live in the space that was emptied out by people that fled or were shot. So the ethnical composition, if you look at the ethnical composition on Crimea, it has already substantially changed. And they know that in a couple of years, the ethnical composition of the occupied areas will have substantially changed. And this is not about East Germany, West Germany. This, if you take the German comparison, this is Kaliningrad, Königsberg. It will never be a German city again. Every German knows that. And if Mariupol stays where it is, it will never be a Ukrainian city again. Of course, I mean, they also know that, for example, Crimea, if it's demilitarized and under international supervision, one can talk about other things. There is still elasticity in a bit of that, but at the core, they want to decide their independence now in this war. And the fourth, and that is also very, very difficult moment to negotiate but it's becoming stronger the longer the war lasts. This is the element of justice in the Ukrainian war aims. It was very fuzzy defined at the beginning of the war, but it becomes stronger the more atrocities happen on the occupied areas. And on sort of from the Ukrainian side is we don't want, if there is peace and we go to Berlin and shop at the Kurfürstendamm and then we meet people who have just ordered all these kind of war crimes in our country and they line up in the supermarket behind us. So if you look at the two war aims, there is not much that normally say, okay, this is war aim A and this is the war aim of nation B, and somewhere in the middle, if everybody cuts down some of the moments, we'll get to a ceasefire. This is particularly impossible, if not extremely difficult in this case. And we haven't yet digressed into legal obstacles. For example, Russia has a constitutional amendment in 2018 that no Russian territory is ever to be given back to anybody. As Russia has annexed 5 of Ukraine's oblasts, it fully controls only one of them, Crimea, but the others it has in its own legal system annexed. That basically puts an end to negotiations. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a law that any peace treaty proposal with Russia would have to undergo a popular vote. And a lot of things that might be explainable to diplomats and foreign policy experts might be completely inexplainable to the population. And you do not get this vote. So there are technical obstacles as well, but I think the mental obstacles are so big that the legal and technical obstacles are actually by far overshadowed. So the war will continue. Well, how will it continue? Ever since Zaluzhny wrote this article about a stalemate, people talk about a static war like trench warfare in World War I. That is partially true. It is by now a war of attrition. Both parties have problems in regaining the initiative and seizing the moment to induce maneuver warfare, like having a breakthrough on the other side and sort of induce decisive operations against the others. That is predominantly because of technological progress in terms of artificial intelligence computing, drones, electronic warfare. You know what the other side is going to do before the other side executes an order. You have fast artillery that can immediately put quite precise fire on whatever the other side is doing. And whoever survives the artillery fire will be caught by first-person view drones. The problem is, of course, for both, resources are not endless. Here I have, for example, the war supply for main battle tanks. Russia has steadily increased its production of new T-90M models. There are now roughly, for this year, they will probably produce 200 of them per year. The large swath of main battle tanks, however, comes from depots, where Russia is refurbishing old Cold War equipment that the Soviet Union had built up over decades. And this basically between 800 and 1,000 main battle tanks they do a year right now. This is supplying the war effort. On the Ukrainian side, Ukraine gets what was left over from Central Eastern Europe, NATO countries transitioning from Warsaw Pact equipment to NATO equipment. That was basically 2022. Last year, they got a bit of Cold War legacy equipment that was refurbished, and this equipment is going to expire this year. If we look into armored transportation, It's pretty much the same picture. So on the left side, you see what Ukraine got, and on the right side, you see what Russia got. Here things look a bit better for Ukraine. Ukraine got a lot of leftovers from the so-called global war on terror. These are light armored vehicles that are no longer needed. It got a lot from former Soviet allies transitioning into NATO standards, and it got a bit of Cold War legacy equipment like Mardas and Bradleys, who were left over from downsizing Western European and American forces after the end of the Cold War. Now, if you see that on the Western side, the kind of green thing, which is this year, is substantially smaller than on the Russian side. That is because the Russians have a continuous defense industry, and they have withdrawn those vehicles they deem repairable, and they are one by one working to restore them and continue to field them into their armed forces. On the Ukrainian side, they live on donations, and these donations are by and large leftover vehicles. The problem is here the two main pools for these donations have either expired, like old Soviet legacy systems, or are about to expire this year. And there is no tangible defense industrial effort to produce much new that Ukraine can use in the next war. On ammunition, or I'll come later to ammunition, the problem for Ukraine to sustain the war, you see here the losses, red Russia, blue Ukraine. Two factors. First, for what it is, Ukraine is doing a good job keeping up a favorable rate of attrition. Purely militarily, this is not a bad sign if you have the attacker constantly assaulting and you induce a lot of losses. The problem, if you compare the Ukrainian loss bars to what Ukraine gets, you will see that while Russia will get not a full replacement of their war losses, because these are basically 2 years, almost 3 years of war, but a partial replacement of their war losses. While on the Ukrainian side, material is getting shorter, and it will be a particularly hard year this year, because we have not yet set up a plan how to, on the long run, produce the armored fighting vehicles Ukraine needs to sustain the war, but our deep storage of second-hand equipment has expired. It's a very similar situation with regard to ammunition. Last year, Ukraine fired roughly 2.4 million shots of artillery ammunition of the various calibers. Out of this, more than 1.5 million came from storages. The Americans last year produced roughly 300,000 rounds, and Europeans produced roughly 650,000 rounds. We delivered roughly half of that to Ukraine. The rest went into our own armed forces or into exports. Defense industrial capacity to produce ammunition will increase. This year, Americans should be able to produce roughly 600,000 rounds. Europeans should be able to produce roughly 1.2 million rounds. But of course, the storage that has supplied Ukraine until now has expired, and our production is not yet at full pace, because we will reach a quite good level of new ammunition production by the end of this year, as we have spent the money on it last year. And that makes a gap in equipment. The problem is, and I'm going back to this chart, if you also see that main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles are the two things that undergo the highest rate of attrition, because artillery systems, air defense systems, they are further back to the front, they don't get killed on such a high pace. For artillery systems, the use of barrels is the limiting factor. Russia, for example, burns through a lot of barrels and reimports them from North Korea. That's why they're using a lot of very old Soviet vintage artillery. Not because it's so good, but you get North Korean barrels for them. But for tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, the problem is you need to produce new stuff, because also when they go bust, they're usually dead for good. Artillery systems usually in the rear get damaged and can be repaired. And this is a huge problem that the West and the Europeans have not yet addressed, either by defense industrial means or by looking for more equipment that they can phase out of their own armed forces. There is a silver lining to this. Ukraine has resurrected its defense industry, or is in the process of resurrecting its defense industry. They produce now roughly 50 infantry fighting vehicles per year. Well, they have lost over 700 in this war, so 50, of course, is a rather low number if you want to go into war supplies, but 50 infantry fighting vehicles a year is more infantry fighting vehicles than all of Europe produces together. So, well, yeah. The problem for Ukraine, because of domestic industrial production, the material front could get substantially better after 2026. Because for Ukraine, they will produce quite a variety of new defense goods this year and by the beginning of next year. But until they are available in quantities that make a difference, it's 2026. There's one catch to that. Until then, we really need to protect Ukrainian cities, otherwise these factories get bombed into rubble. And that's why we have now, and that's why in every European meeting we have a scramble to get air defense missiles, especially those capable of intercepting ballistic missiles, in effect, Patriots. And how far and how many Patriots we will get, we will probably decide survival in the war on the Ukrainian side. Yeah, so that is roughly how the war will progress. It does not look very good from this moment. However, there is a lot of doom and gloom that is unjustified as of now, because we still have the financial and military potential to turn things around. We just have to commit. That is a political problem. That is a financial problem for a lot of member states to discuss, but it's nothing that is undoable. What we should not take into account are the normal options. First of all, to hope for a ceasefire. This is widespread in the West, especially in Washington, D.C. and in Berlin. Even these days, there is the constant belief that there will be a ceasefire. When I was in Washington, D.C. in April, before the start of the counteroffensive, the prevailing mood in Washington was there will be one counteroffensive and then Putin will negotiate. Well, he didn't. And spoiler alert, even if the Ukrainian counteroffensive would have been successful, Putin would not have negotiated. He would have continued his war of attrition from an adverse line. But even with a fully successful counteroffensive, Ukrainian army was not in a position to completely vindicate the Russian forces. If we shall go back to which is always in discussion floating up, the April 2022 negotiations, we see actually how far the two are apart. This was not a ceasefire that was agreed upon or something that flied. The Russians wanted the Ukrainian army to be restricted to 85,000 men and 350 armored fighting vehicles, so main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other fighting vehicles put together, which is de facto demilitarization and making Ukraine vulnerable to any renewed attack. Second, Russia wanted to have the security guarantees to be bound to a unanimous decision amongst all grantor states. So basically, Russia had a veto that when it attacked Ukraine again, the other countries could not do anything. But the Russian proposal also included that all military-to-military relations and arms sales to Ukraine by the West were prohibited. So of course you just have to wait and the Ukrainian army would degrade and then you can attack again. Putin also was unwilling to put anything about the occupied territories in the treaty. Ukraine at the time still hoped that one could at least negotiate a return to the boundaries of February 23rd, but Russia wanted nothing to do with it. And now they have formally annexed 4 further oblasts. So even on that, this proposal has not provided any ground for a compromise in April 2022, and the stakes have only risen and things got harder. Of course, there's constant news about a possible ceasefire and the possibility of negotiations, and the Russians are using this very cleverly because they know that in the West, diplomacy is seen as something more civilized than war, something that would transcend war, something that would end the war. In Russia, diplomacy is seen as a tool of war. You engage in negotiations to get better preconditions for military actions, not to end them or to suppress them. This is very much similar to the way Slobodan Milosevic in the Balkan Wars has conducted its negotiations. If you remember all the Vance Stoltenberg plans and Vance Owen plans for Bosnia, they were all negotiations that were continuing to distract the West from what is happening militarily on the ground. And militarily, things were happening on the ground as Belgrade at the time pleased, because they had the advantage of having the armed stockpiles of the former Yugoslav People's Army, but the Croats and Bosnians had nothing, and there was a universal arms embargo, so as long as you negotiate and keep the universal arms embargo, you can do whatever you want on the ground. Then NATO intervened in 1994, and due to NATO intervention, the Republika Srpska was, well, short of collapse, and suddenly Milosevic, of course, signed the Dayton Agreement. Not that what in the Dayton Agreement was not known or negotiated before, it was negotiated years before, but you only start to take this seriously once you're on the losing side on the battlefield. And the same mentality is with Putin. He's basically Milosevic with nukes. The problem is, of course, for Ukraine to get into the position that the Croats and the Bosniaks were in 1995 is quite a tall order. It's not unfeasible, but it's a tall order. The other thing that is widely debated is the issue of land for peace. Shouldn't Ukraine freeze the war, agree, okay, these territories are lost, but the rest of Ukraine gets integrated into EU and NATO and sort of is happily ever after. As I said before, this kind of talk about the West German model is seen differently from Ukraine because there is no East Ukraine as there was in East Germany. The other problem is, as long as the war is still ongoing, what territory then exactly is NATO territory and will be defended by the alliance as such if you promise them NATO membership? It is, in short of a ceasefire, there will be no agreed demarcation line. If there's no agreed demarcation line, where does alliance territory start? It would be politically quite impossible to divide Ukraine into a real alliance territory and a gray zone. I don't think a lot of, especially those countries who have past historical experience with being divided up, would support that. And then on a final stage, if you induce the perspective of NATO membership into a negotiating or peace proposal, who guarantees NATO membership? We've seen over the past years, Greece has blocked Northern Macedonia for the namesake. France and Germany in 2008 have blocked Ukraine and Georgia. Turkey and Hungary have made a fuss about Sweden and Finland, compared to Ukraine, where a war is still going on, is much easier to swallow. And while a lot of European countries actually might now, of course, say lip service, yes, of course, Ukraine has the right to join the NATO, but under the condition of a still ongoing war, to introduce a gray zone where Russia is, where sort of Article 5 is quite mushy because you have occupying troops and the demarcation line is not so sure and you have transitional territories, etc. It's the ideal playground for Russia to actually test the resolve, and that is what Europeans are most afraid of. Not a full contingent of a Russian invasion that tries to drive NATO into the Atlantic in 4 days, but this kind of continuous testing and undermining of Article 5 to the point that NATO as a political body and security guarantor becomes useless. So politically, while such ideas make good op-eds in the newspaper, they are basically impossible to implement practically. Could there be bilateral security guarantees? Of course they could. But just as a remember, all the security assistance treaties that Ukraine has concluded with other G7 and NATO member countries are assistance measures. None of the Western countries is really willing to give a security guarantee in terms of promising Ukraine that it will enter war on its behalf if Russia attacks. And to be frank, it would arguably be quite difficult to do that for a lot of countries, even if they want to promise it, because the beauty of a collective security organization like NATO is if the other side attacks, we are all at war. So you don't have to ponder about the other country's reactions, and you have prepared defense plans, what is supposed to happen in the case of and then there are multiple scenarios. But if you only have bilateral security guarantees, actually in the event of an aggression, the Germans don't know what the French will do, the French don't know what the Americans will do. Maybe there is political turmoil in Washington and you have a guy like Trump, so you actually don't know what he's going to do anyway. All that makes bilateral security guarantees quite vulnerable in terms of crisis stability. And this is exactly the reason why we only have security assistance measures. Because none of the countries has either a domestic mandate in terms of voters would support, I don't know, a German division on the Avdiivka sector to keep it quiet, nor the capabilities to grant security on their own. And the only country that would have are the Americans, and they don't have the domestic mandate. So the last kind of shadow boxing with something that is proposed but utterly unimplementable is neutrality and the idea of making Ukraine a neutral state. First of all these past concepts about the buffer states and getting out of in-between, etc., were based on the perception that Russia is a rational actor that is just interested in its passive security, which we know by now it is not. It is about Russian identity. It's an irrational actor. The second thing is, during the Cold War, and this is for me as an Austrian actually more obvious than, of course, to current Americans, during the Cold War, it was quite an effort to keep neutrals alive. It was not an effort-free event. And it was made by the Americans. It was part of Washington's geopolitical DNA that every country opposed to the Soviet Union, I'm not even saying every free democracy, every country opposed to the Soviet Union deserves American support. The biggest recipient of foreign military aid from Washington in the early 50s and late 40s was Yugoslavia after the Tito-Stalin split. There were even there were general staff consultations between Tito and Montgomery, who at the time was the Mediterranean commander of NATO, about how to commonly defend against Soviet aggression between Yugoslavia and NATO. Austria, America gave an explicit guarantee for Austria's survival when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956. There were informal consultations when they invaded the Czech Republic. There were permanent military consultations with Sweden about a possible reaction to a Russian aggression, and Swedish air bases were part of the US nuclear strike plan against the Soviet Union should a war in Europe erupt. Sweden and Finland had clandestine military relations with the US. Austria, while the proponent of contemporary neutrality say that, well, Austria in the Staatsvertrag, it was written that it was neutral. No, it was not. Austria's neutrality was a unilateral declaration in the neutrality law of October 26, 1955. The state treaty, the Austrian state treaty, sorry, my notes, had clauses that were called Anschlussverbot. We were forbidden to have a military alliance with Germany, and we were forbidden to have a customs or political alliance with Germany, but not with any other state. Now, if you look into the Cold War order of battle, in the Cold War, NATO had 3 regional commands in Europe: North, Center, South. South, the headquarters was in Rome. Mr. Montgomery was the first Allied commander there. Where was the boundary between Center, and which was Germany, and South? Was it the Alps? No. It was the Austrian-German border. Because Austria was, although forbidden to have a military alliance with Germany, it said nothing about Italy. And in the case of war, of course, we would be subordinated to the Rome-based Southern Command. That was our neutrality. The problem is this geopolitical DNA of the Americans, that every non-aligned country deserves support and is to be supported even militarily. This is gone. I mean, Donald Trump leads the polls in the US. Who shall guarantee, who shall again maintain Ukraine as a neutral state? Unless you have this clear mechanism, and even if you don't agree on it formally, you need to have the informal knowledge that the United States in an emergency will be on your side to go down that path, which we don't have. So all these scenarios make very good op-eds, but they make very bad policy. For the time being, the war will continue. It will continue for some years. That's the bad news and the sobering news. And even if the war ends, there will not be peace. The war has entrenched this anti-Western hysteria in the Russian elites. The war has radicalized Russian society to a point we have never seen before. The Russian security apparatus is structurally involved in war crimes, if not genocide, in the occupied territories. If you have done that, and as an Austrian, I can tell you that that's unfortunately true. You clinch onto every stupid lie, regardless how stupid, that rationalize your behavior. Because if you have done the stuff that the Russians do in the occupied areas, you don't want to question yourself morally and politically why you have supported that or why you have done that. And if even the most stupid, outrageous nonsense provides you with the situational comfort that you acted under pressure or served your country with what you did, you'll take that. The Germans cut the corner in 1945 because they're occupied. Even if Ukraine win, Russia will not be occupied. If Russia wins, then we have a radicalized, militarized Russia on our borders that supports general military confrontation with the West. So this will also not be peace. So even if the war ends, we will not have peace. Yeah, but my speech ends here.
Merci, Gustave, pour cette conférence, ce propos.
Thank you, Gustave, for this lecture. We're looking, aren't we, at no man's land as regards possible proposals. But let me first ask you about the origins of the conflict. Ideas lead to
consequences, as Richard Brummer used to say. If you have a materialistic reading of history or Marxist reading of history, you could look at the interests of states, but then you have the power of ideology. But here you have a war that is very much ideological, in as much as, irrespective of restoring the Russian power, the Russian identity, but others had tried it before. And elsewhere in Syria, and not necessarily on the ground, in cyber warfare, for instance. But let's imagine for a second that Russia should have been able to implement its plan as early as 2022. Imagine that it was in a position to go beyond the present situation. Where would it stop? Where would its appetite stop? If it's a matter of restoring Russia into its historic rights, historic borders, well, you have the situation, the political position of Belarus, you have the issue of limited sovereignty of Georgia, you have Ukraine, the Baltic states, Moldova. Where does it stop? Where does the imperial or imperialistic project stop? Is Ukraine part of a greater scheme or not? I mean, that is the concern that we have. I mean, and the fact that this could spill over into Moldova, or might we consider that in return for its failure, for Putin, he would consider a victory if he had final annexation of Crimea and Donbass. I mean, is Putin's political objective, even here, hasn't spelled it out, but temporarily he might be content, at least that would can be sufficient for his ideological reasoning. Well, Crimea, Donbass were Russian-speaking, they were never clearly attributed in the past, and they really belonged to Russia. Would he be satisfied with that? I don't know. That's the question number one. But then we'll address the present state of affairs, this static war, this war of attrition. We'll get to that in the next question, if you like. And then what would be the conditions of a ceasefire? What could possibly constitute acceptable conditions? But for the first point, as far as your analysis, what is the ideological limit? When will Putin's ideological aims be met? When would he feel satisfied? Because he is facing resistance, isn't he? And he is not reaching out, and even in Russian opinion, public opinion.
Yes, he's facing resistance, and the problem of that is it makes Russian goals a kind of self-reinforcing snowball towards escalation. Because the Russian Federation, as it was before the war, or as it was before Crimea, demanded influence that were above what it also was willing to deliver to others. Because influence, on the one hand, of course, yes, it's a matter of respect and anticipation and power, but on the other hand, influence is also something you earn yourself by taking care of the demands, interests, and sorrows of those countries you have influence in. It's always work to run an alliance. That was actually the main reason why the last generation of the Soviet elites and the Soviet governors had an interest in dissolving the USSR, because it was consuming too much resources in keeping it upright, that they wanted to invest in Russia proper and not somewhere in Georgia or elsewhere in the periphery. So Russia, on the one hand, demands this kind of respect, on the other hand, can't fulfill or can't act as a grantor. Look at Armenia, how dissatisfied Armenia is with Russia's role as a security provider. And that gives quasi the recipe for this kind of explosion, because you demand these countries to obey your orders and sort of treat you as the Tsar above the kings, but on the other hand, you don't do anything for them, or you do too few for them. So they will, of course, look for other Tsars or Shahs or whomever they find to get their interests being dealt with. It is a recipe of self-conceptualization on the Russian side that basically inevitably leads to conflict. What could have happened in 2022 if Russia were successful or as successful? Well, the problem is the Russian intelligence operation that made them think they could win this quickly was so fraudulent and so made up of their own bureaucratic interest. Bogdanov published these meetings of the FSB before that, and it's hilarious. When the FSB, the Fifth Department, tried to make clear to Putin that Ukraine will fight back and they're not. Our political structures in Ukraine are too weak to actually really second an invasion with a political coup. He told them, well, but over the past decades, I gave you billions to build that up. Where is it? Of course, the money is somewhere in southern France or in Spain or in Madeira or elsewhere, and they have siphoned it off. But then these poor FSB people had to come back to Putin to tell him that everything was right because they need to justify their own expenses on that. But they, of course, knew that it wouldn't be right and it wouldn't work. We know that Russia wanted to have a complicit in the West. They approached the Poles. They probably also approached Viktor Orban to sort of, we take 80% of Ukraine, and then we want to have somebody from the EU who takes also a small part in order to sort of diversify the criminal endeavor, especially into a Western state in order to dodge the consequences of sanctions. The Poles said no immediately. I'm not so sure Viktor Orban said no about Transcarpathy Oblast. But on the other hand, it would have been sort of then 95% of Ukraine controlled by Russia and a small part by Hungary. Roughly, sort of this was, or at least sort of Kiev, there was a military operation. How far they would have gone west, for how many losses, because they would have faced resistance, is of course a matter of speculation. The problem is, under any case, they would have faced Ukrainian resistance, even if they had planned the war more cleverly, if they had really followed up their strikes against Ukrainian air defense, if they had systematically degraded that from the beginning and not sort of making their battle damage assessment a affair of wishful thinking, they could have won the war militarily, not in 3 days, not in 3 weeks, but in 3, 4, 5 months, roughly. But then it would still have been a bloody endeavor. Then they would have to take care of the guerrilla and counter-occupation operation that would run, and that would probably be supported across the border. So the war would have changed in character, but the state of unpeace would have remained the same. Where would Russian imperialism stop? I think where it is stopped. One of the key problems, Putin thought that Ukraine was so weak that it was up for grabs. Now they think that Ukraine, the West, is so weak that they will cease support and they can win by 2025. They're already making predictions on that. And this is why we see now Moldova and these operations and sort of these drone strikes and destabilization, because that's sort of the propaganda ground for the next thing after that. Because they know that Moldova is weak and then would be for grabs. But well, let's see.
But yes, the Russians are also forced to integrate the results of their failure in the switch from hybrid warfare to open warfare, what they used to do to the Ukraine war. One thing is for sure, they didn't conquer Ukraine. And even though militarily they would be in a way to able to dominate, they are not able to occupy and control effectively. So does that mean that in their propaganda, which would be a sign of backtracking ideologically to safer positions, wouldn't it make more sense for them to say that we've almost reached it, we are going to reach more immediate goals, even though after that they'll have to come back to less regular forms of warfare, hybrid combat that they used to wage and they'll probably wage again in the future. So the question is that it would be interesting to see how political propaganda would change and shift on that. And maybe to really tackle the other thing, because in a way that may prepare assumptions for an exit to the crisis, what shouldn't happen is that Putin should impose the exit conditions for an end to hostilities, that's for sure. But at some point, the question will arise. But the question arises differently today, because you said that very well. At a time which is particularly critical, I won't come back to that. You expressed that very well. But isn't there a risk now, because we're a bit frontline against frontline, a risk of escalation or of it spilling over? Now, if the war is kind of set, there's no switch from conventional to nuclear, despite Putin's gesticulations. This is traditional Russian grammar. There's no spilling over to another front. Some say that Gaza, but there was opportunistic use of another conflict that was convenient, but there's no spillover towards Transnistria. And it would be very difficult for them if they haven't consolidated their military positions now. And there shouldn't be any co-belligerence. The issue would be a war between Russia and Ukraine, and there the support provided would be as the way the Soviet or Chinese provided support to Viet Cong fighters. So in a way, some countries would become co-belligerents. If there are two strong warning signs, we would start talking again, especially between Americans and Russians. Russians follow the Montreux Treaty. So there also the war is managed. But this war is managed, except that at some point you can see that unless there's a breaking point, which might be risky because there's a temporary lack of sufficient ammunition for the Ukrainians, the question is how that could spill over. And that's the question that's asked regarding the weapons delivered to Ukraine to strike more towards the back of the lines, to have less of a head-on setup, but go farther. How far? That's the issue of the Russians. And on the Russian side, what could be the elements of a spillover that don't trigger escalation, do not unravel the conflict? Because we could go up one notch further. So do you first share this idea, or do you think, conversely, that the situation's found a certain fluidity, viscosity, and we're not safe from an escalation which the public opinion fears?
Thanks a lot. These are excellent questions. I will actually start with nuclear escalation to bit rationalize this, because yes, it's a very dynamic situation. The threshold when to go in nuclear and the goals one can follow through, they are not static. They always relate to the conventional phase of the war. When the war began, Putin was very confident that the nuclear deterrent would isolate Ukraine from Western support. And that was the key function of Russia's nuclear arsenal, to peel off the international support and make them afraid. However, that rested on roughly 4 pillars. The first pillar is that at the end, Ukraine means more to Russia than to Europe or to the West, and you have a disparity of values. The second pillar is Russian victory will be so quick that the rest of the international scenery will not come up with a final opinion on what they think about the Russian nuclear release or not. They will be stunned by the progress of the war, and they will basically then accept the status quo that Russia has created. Number 3, Russia went to war with only the high readiness PTGs, the battalion tactical groups. So of all the Russian formations, they took the professional soldier man's battalion, sent that to war, but there were still 3 or 2 battalions in every regiment or brigade that were not at war. So Russia had large ammunition stockpiles. Russia had still a conventional strike capability. So Russia went to war with one part of the military, but would still continue to be a multi-domain threat to NATO, not only a nuclear threat, but they had a conventional army, they had their navy, they had their air force, and they could react to any Western reaction in turn and feed the nuclear threat with a conventional threat that would play into this. And fourth, and last but not least, as Russia was expected to win, so in the progress of winning, this would free up further Russian forces and make the military situation for Ukraine dire and dire. This would increase Russia's options to both conventionally and non-conventionally strike against NATO, and on the other hand, make the options for NATO to some point narrow to a binary decision, either fully escalation or leave it. And then NATO would leave the theater because they would not risk total nuclear war for Ukraine. The problem is all these pillars were shaken. First of all, the political support Ukraine got, the refugee support, the societal support made Russia kind of aware that the disparity of values on this conflict was not as sharp as they thought. The second thing is, there is already an opinion of other key international partners for Russia on a nuclear release. The Chinese would hate the idea, not because they are so obedient to international law and love the current international order, but the Chinese see that the South Koreans have ballistic missile submarines and a lot of carrier means and a lot of nuclear industry, and that they're very nervous about what happens there, and that if Russia would use a nuclear weapon to instate itself on Ukraine, that this would make other countries like South Korea make them abandon the NPT and go nuclear themselves, because they see that kind of conventional security and the international system does not protect the security of non-nuclear states against a nuclear aggressor, and they have a neighborhood with North Korea and China as both unpredictable and not so nice nuclear neighbors. So the Chinese immediately said, no, you don't need to do that. We'll support you under the hand with other means, and economically we'll keep you afloat against sanctions, but you don't go nuclear. That is the clear condition for Chinese support for the war, for Russia. And India sees it similarly. The fourth factor, the conventional threat to NATO. Russia now has 410,000 soldiers in Ukraine. At the beginning of the invasion, they had like 170,000 entering Ukraine. So there is no second army to lead a second war. Also, a lot of the ammunition that they would need to protect their assets against NATO strikes are expended to a large extent. They have fired so many S-300 against Ukrainian cities, trying to hope to hit something. These S-300 is the mainstay of their air defense for the troops, for their ships, for their air bases. So these missiles, this ammunition, this would be needed to keep NATO away from your most valuable military objects. The second thing is you don't have a second army anywhere, because those skeleton units that are still present in Russia, they are busy training the guys that go to Ukraine to the war, because there's a constant need to replace losses. So Russia to the West is only a nuclear threat, not a conventional anymore. Any escalation would immediately be nuclear, and Russia has no means to control an escalation below the nuclear threshold. And that's, of course, a game that can easily go completely wrong for Russia. So you try not to do that. On the other hand, because Russia is not winning, actually the Western options to poke Russia have increased. Now Ukraine fires Western-made cruise missiles. Nobody thought that they would be able to do that, but they're restricted politically by us not to fire into Russian territory, etc. So, and that's why Russian nuclear rhetoric has dialed down, I mean, beyond the lunatics on Russian state TV, but the official rhetoric is not so aggressive anymore, because they know that the threat of a nuclear escalation, first of all, if they strike something in Ukraine, it would have consequences. It would have consequences with the Chinese. It would have consequences with the Americans. And it would have a dubious military value to have a symbolic strike on one of the Ukrainian brigades. The Ukrainian army now has 127 brigades. If you nuke one, it's not the end of the war. So this cost-benefit relation is not there. So now actually things that were seen as escalatory at the beginning of the war aren't. And this is a constant dynamic. This might change if Russia sees it gains the upper hand. If Ukrainian conventional forces deteriorate, it might feel also more important on the nuclear sphere. But they are closely interrelated, and there's no apodictic red line on the one side or on the other, where I said if you do A, then you enter the nuclear arms race. On weapon supplies, I'm actually quite relaxed. I mean, the Russians know the game, and seeing what they have supplied to the Koreans, North Koreans, and the North Vietnamese, or Ethiopia, or basically it's now they have to endure that on their own, and they will. The problem, of course, is on how far we allow Ukraine to strike on Russian territory. Ukrainians are also testing the ground. How far can they go? How far can they not go? I think we are a bit too nervous here, but I can also see the kind of division of labor with Western weapons. You take care of the occupied territories, also in basically support of the Western political goals to have territorial integrity as the to-be-achieved war aim. And whatever you do to disturb the Russian war economy, you do with your own stuff. I think that is quite a safe mechanism to keep us out of harm's way. And if the Russians would start to think otherwise, we have pre-warning times. We can observe their movements of nuclear units. We can observe when they start to withdraw things from storage. It's not that a nuclear escalation kind of falls from the sky and happens by just you wake up and boom. And in such an event, you can always have a phone call with Kiev and say, look, guys, this is driving them to the edge. And we know that within this time span, they're thinking about a release, and then it's up to the West. You have a phone call to Moscow to dissuade them, but of course you will liaise with the Ukrainians what they should seize or not do in order to not have a bomb thrown on them. And I guess there will be some interest in Kiev to listen to that, because nobody is in interest to be the object of a nuclear release. So yeah, that's a part of crisis management to keep the escalation in bay. I don't think it's completely undoable and unfeasible thing.
Just maybe one comment, and then I'll give the floor to students for questions. But we can't speak for the Ukrainians. We are involved in this war to contain the Russian invasion, to push it back as far as possible, to allow Ukraine to regain its sovereign rights as far as possible. But if we want to find a political exit, although it's a solution that you've kind of excluded, couldn't we come back naturally to ideas that were those of what should be done in case of an operational success of a Ukrainian pushback last year? Maybe at some point we could find a possible ceasefire and de-escalation of hostilities. It's true that it would be a fait accompli situation that nobody would recognize, that doesn't eventuate into a peace treaty. There would still be areas that would be contested, but after having lost a lot on both sides, it would make sense to stop there. Of course, after pushing the Russians back as far as possible towards the east. But all the solutions that made it possible in the past to stop a conflict without a winner or a loser. Of course, I'm not going to use diplomatic language here. It is up to the Ukrainians to decide whether they accept to discuss such solutions, partly, but maybe that would be a possible way out. I'll stop here for those considerations that I think you'll discuss. First questions from the students. So, questions? Hello, thank you so much for your lecture. I have a question regarding what the war in Ukraine reveals about the European project. Do you think that it's revelative of a failure or a success? Because we've seen aid packages that were voted, the European Peace Facility that was mobilized to support Ukraine, but on the other hand, a lot of dissensions, the blockage by Hungary for the aid packages sent to Ukraine for months, the inability to set up a war economy or send 1 million shells to Ukraine. Thank you. Another question? Well, you're quite silent, aren't you? What's happening? You were probably happy with. He's a student. He's a quite older student, but for students, please wake up. Well, I fully agree. Could we really exclude a collapse of Ukraine because of a breakthrough by Russia that could go very quickly towards Kiev? Thank you. Yes, now they've woken up. It'll have taken them some time, but I think they were impressed by the breadth of your lecture. I saw you, sir. I will take your question later. Thank you very much for your lecture. I wanted to ask a question about the Baltic Sea with the recent integration of Sweden into NATO and exercises happening right now with joint forces in the Baltic Sea and northern territories. I wanted to know whether, well, it's very unlikely, but if Russia could go further than Ukraine, could there be another operation against NATO in the Baltic area? And in that case, what would the options be for a confrontation between NATO and Russia? Thank you. Well, I'll let you answer the first 3 questions while the others prepare their questions. Yes, I saw you wanted one. And also on the web, we won't forget, yes.
Okay. So what does the current war reveal about the European project? I actually have to say I'm pretty positively surprised about the Europeans, that this will be messy, that Europeans love to argue amongst themselves, that we are usually quite disunited, that everybody tries to claim the most fame for himself and tries to spend the least on the problem, is something that shouldn't surprise anybody, because that's the status quo that has been going on in Europe for all the time. But actually, compared to past crises, if I look into how we reacted to the Balkan War, which of course was a crisis on minor scale, we have done a lot of progress. I scratch my head about a lot of decisions, like not going into war economy, postponing a lot of decisions on the increase of production. But at the end, we are We then have to make expensive detours, like buying artillery ammunition off the shelf market, and we will probably have another tank crisis, an infantry weapons, infantry fighting vehicle crisis, an air defense crisis quite soon, where we'll have similar situations where the front is quite close to collapse, and it might take a miracle to save it, but the Czechs have provided the miracle, and the Czech Republic is not the mightiest European country, but they make really an effort in this. So actually, we, compared from how we behaved in the past, we're actually doing quite well, and we're doing quite well as Europeans, with the exception of Orban and Austria, but otherwise, you know, everything is relative. Could we exclude a Ukrainian collapse? No. The thing now, Russia tries to, or tried, now the first batches of the Czech ammunition plan arrived, and the ammunition situation became better. So we see a bit of a dialing down of the Russian offensives, but they try to use this moment of weakness on the Ukrainian side to push them to a collapse as much as they can. The Ukrainians, by virtue and discipline, have avoided that, but it's something that with each of these assaults, you never know how it flies. The Russians have managed to break into Ukrainian positions over the past 3 months, various times, but Ukrainians always could prevent Russians from exploiting and creating a breakthrough. It was break in, but not breakthrough. And these are tense situations. If then things go wrong, if tactical commanders make the wrong decisions, sometimes if you just have bad luck, things can go horribly wrong. Now, the Russian army in itself also is not in the best position to make deep maneuver breakthroughs, because they consist to a large scale of officers that had crash course training, that are not yet on the level of experience they have, that their logistics are still in a state they need improvement. So I was a bit puzzled why Gerasimov ordered this big offensive this spring, because like Ukrainians went into the counteroffensive insufficiently prepared. The Russians went also in this winter offensive insufficiently prepared, having sort of reconstituted forces very quickly and just tried, because numerical superiority in artillery fires on a spreadsheet, on Excel looked good, and then they went. And a lot of soft factors said, well, you should probably not go now. But this is how it went, and it could have gone wrong. The Baltic situation, the good thing about especially the Swedish NATO accession, it for the first time provides a depth for NATO to defend the Baltic countries. You can station airplanes there, you can station long-range missiles there that support a defensive operations in the Baltics. You have better lines of communication. Kaliningrad is not that big of an issue anymore because you have the Tier 2 via Sweden. And there are, I think, 12 agreements for different installations and bases that NATO will erect, or the Americans will bilaterally do there. So we will have an increased military infrastructure in Sweden to be the central hub in the Baltic and the big rear that you need to defend that. The problem with the Baltics is because it was so isolated before, that a Russian offensive with limited objectives was possible on the terms that Russia would not, as I said, the aim is not to drive NATO in its entirety into the Atlantic in 4 days, but at a time of crisis, at a time, I don't know, a Trump or Trump-like president is unpredictable, you induce a strategic shock that NATO, for the lack of preparedness, depth, mobility, cannot care about, and then kind of from this position start to negotiate, look, here's our proposal for a European security order, which means you all go bowing to Moscow, And if you do not have appetite for this, then we will restart such an operation at the next instances, and then kind of have the rest of the Europeans squabble around this. This kind of opportunistic attack gets much less likely now that Sweden is in NATO, because it's much harder to pull off. And while the Baltic countries, they also increase their defense spending, they set up new forces, etc., the big question mark in defending the Baltics was always the air situation, because of the proximity of Russian airfields and the superiority of the aircraft. And now with Sweden, we have enough airfields to challenge exactly that. So here, yeah, things in the north have become much, much, much better. If I would guess where the Russians would make trouble, if they want to make trouble, I would, beyond Ukraine, I would rather hint towards the Balkans. But actually they might, if I see what Trump's son and Mr. Grenell do on the Balkans, we actually don't need the Russians for that. I think we might be able to pull such a nonsense on our own quite soon. If.
Je vais prendre d'autres questions. Alors maintenant tout le monde lève la main. Alors monsieur ici.
Everybody is raising their hands at the same time. So, yeah, well, I see you. Sir.
Je vais faire la suite en français.
I will continue in English. What do you think of Germany's position on the Ukraine war? You have obstruction as regard the delivery of Leopard tanks, the issue of dependence on the Russian gas. On many issues, Scholz and Germany were simply not up to the task. What is your assessment being in Berlin? All right. Yes, miss? Good evening, and thank you for your paper, for your lecture. After the Russian elections, what's your view on the effects on the conflict, but the effects on European security? You mean Putin's election, yes. Yes, a question there. And then maybe a final question. Should there be a ceasefire negotiations? Because of the Russification of Donbass and Crimea, it's too late, isn't it, for these regions? In particular, Crimea, in terms of numbers, there were 2.3 million inhabitants. 1 million have moved to Ukraine because, and then they were replaced by 1 million Russian. So Crimea is already finished, isn't it? All right. Well, thank you. Gustav?
Well, given the history that some other Austrians who went to Germany have done in Eastern Europe, I will refrain from a comment on sort of dividing other countries to the east. That's basically a thing Ukrainians need to decide. But for example, Crimea, which is, yes, is the most Russified part of the country. The problem is still, even if Ukrainians would say, okay, sort of the fait accompli is so much there, we don't want Crimea back because we don't want these people to vote in our elections, then it would still be the issue of security. Would the Russian military be present there, or could you agree to a UN force or whatever? Ukrainians tend to be enormously skeptic about Russia keeping Crimea as a military base. Whatever else is then agreed is up for negotiations, but this kind of, basically huge aircraft carrier and only barracks and aircraft and airfields, that's something that from a Ukrainian side is critical. The Ukrainians also know that Crimea is the centerpiece of Russia's presence in Ukraine. This is why their military operations, their strikes go towards Crimea, because they know that once you put Crimea in question, then Putin will negotiate seriously. because they know that this is the thing he really cares about. If he has to give up other territory to preserve Crimea, he will. On the elections and their effect in Europe, I was not surprised by the outcome. Russia is the state it is. It's unfortunate. We have to deal with it. I mean, one part of the dealing is that, and that is my kind of part, deterrence, preparedness, missile bases, airfields, etc. There is another part of the preparedness, that is the Russian diaspora that came to Europe and that is against the war. And this is not my field of expertise, but I think I should say two things about them. First, we need to take their personal security seriously. They're now under observation and prosecution by the Russian regime, and in many countries they are not safe. Volkov was attacked with a hammer, but I know numerous Russian opposition peoples who have their letterboxes broken in, who had burglars in their flats that didn't steal anything, but seemed to look at the entire flat, that face threats by other Russians who claim to be residents of Germany, etc. And this is our security obligations to not be the playing ground for Tiergarten assassinations and other nonsense. The second thing is we need to institutionalize these people somehow in order to preserve a body and knowledge about Russia that we can use if things change. Because in a generation from now, they will all become happy Europeans. Just like a lot of Huguenots became happy Germans, and, a lot of Austrian Protestants became happy Americans, etc. Because it's an asset. A lot of them are extremely bright people. What do I think about Germany? It's complex. So first, I think there is a huge misunderstanding of what the Zeitenwende speech meant at the time and why it doesn't give any guidance to what we do now. If you remember the weeks before the Russian invasion, the Germans said there won't be a war. This is all exaggerations by the British and the Americans. We have better lines of communication into Russia. We know what they want concessions in the Donbass, but there won't be a war. So they said, yeah, but all these financial sanctions, closing Nord Stream 2, that's all too radical. Why should we make our economy nervous about a thing that will never happen? And they were quite arrogant in lecturing other countries that they know better about Russia. Of course, this mood didn't last very long and very well. And Zeitenwende speech basically was about, okay, the German Sonderweg with Russia has ended and we are a good ally. Now we behave like we did in the Cold War. We'll increase our defense spending. We'll be a good NATO ally. We don't make kind of special policies towards Russia. We'll do whatever the others do because clearly we failed on this and you were right. So, for example, Scholz's rationalization of giving weapons to Ukraine, he said, well, we also give weapons to a conflict area. That was the announcement. Not that we want Ukraine to win, we want Ukraine to survive. We do that because all the other allies do that and we don't stick out. But there was no strategy behind it because the strategy was made in Washington and Germany will play its part. And that explains a lot why things became so complicated later on, because if you don't have a strategy and if you don't have forums and if you don't know what you want to actually achieve, it's very difficult to conceive the means and the policies to make a thing happen that you don't know what it is. And that was exacerbated by a split that was unoutspoken between the Greens and the larger parts of the Free Democrats, is the Liberal Party, who wanted Ukraine to win and who saw the war as a central issue for European security, and the Free Democrats cared more about, will a post-war Ukraine be economically, politically sustainable, and how much would it cost if it were not. The Greens were more about order and values and the political side, but regardless. And then you had Scholz, who thinks that Ukraine can't win this anyway. And even if they could, they really shouldn't, because they will drive us into nuclear war. Scholz is extremely concerned about nuclear escalation, and that makes him extremely hesitant whenever you put up a weapon system on display that he thinks is offensive and will drive Russia towards nuclear war, like main battle tanks, and now like Taurus. The problem also is with Taurus, and you know, I don't know how much I should digress into technical issues, that some of his advisors in kind of a whatever mood they were, thought that this would be an ideal opportunity. We're not delivering Taurus, and we are making up this rationale that Taurus is so technically complex that only German soldiers can handle it. And so if Ukraine uses Taurus, we would need German soldiers that either at home or in Ukraine help them with programming the thing. And that would make us party to war, and we can't be party to war. And they already sort of started out the messaging that the SPD, the chancellor, is sort of, that mayors, etc., posted tweets like, Scholz is preventing us from being party to the war. All the others would have dragged us into the conflict already. And of course, you could clearly see the election strategy for next year. Scholz is at the same time the guy who supports Ukraine, but on the other side, the Chancellor of Peace, where he wants basically to make good for both camps within the Social Democratic Party. You have the younger core voters who want Ukraine to be supported, and you have the elderly SPD Ostpolitik people who fear that Sarah Wagenknecht, the left-wing populist, akin to Mélenchon, will take their votes away. And he wanted to have both. Now, of course, the problem with that, the technical details he gave for that, they're not entirely true. And then there was the leak, where German Air Force officers discussed the technicalities of delivering Taurus, and that proved that all the public reasoning for not delivering them were wrong. And now this, of course, is the happy time for the opposition, because they know that the government is split on that. They know that Scholz has a hard time explaining himself, and if you force them to debate this thing, you put the Greens and the FDP in an enormously difficult spot, because either they support the Chancellor, but they really can't on the grounds that the Chancellor gave, or they openly split with him, which sort of both work for the opposition. And I, of course, have happy times with that. To me personally, I have to say, yeah, there would be one reason to at least consider not to deliver Taurus and consider, for example, the swap deal with the UK. That is, if you look into the successor for Storm Shadow and Scalp, the French-British missile, there is already a project for the successor. It will be flight testing in a couple of years, and it should be in production by 2030. The Taurus will be the first-line deep strike weapon of Germany until the 2040s. The successor is a part of the FCAS program, which is, yeah, not difficult. Yeah, difficult is the best word. So I can see the hesitation from a German point of view to say, yeah, if things go wrong, if, you know, the weapon is compromised, it's a different thing for the British and the French, because in a couple of years, it's not their first-line weapon, and they have exported this to countries like Egypt, etc. You've already used that in Syria against the Islamic State, but also against against Bashar al-Assad. So the Russians have already a radar picture on how the thing flies, etc. So it's not really top secret, the way that the Taurus still is. So if you're afraid of that, there is a rationale to say, okay, let's not. Then you could still say, well, we could lease, for example, the Taurus to the British, because they have the Eurofighter system. Integration is easier done in the UK, and the British could send more Storm Shadows to Ukraine, because Ukrainians are already trained on the missile, they have the infrastructure to launch it. All that we would have to take a lot of money into our hands to enable Ukrainians to do so. So there's actually a rationale for that. The problem is if you start to emotionalize, and if you start to think, make these emotional statements about Germany becoming party of war and kind of try to play with sentiments, then for me personally, now this Taurus debate is more about, truth, democracy, democratic culture of debate. You shouldn't play with fears of the population to maximize your voters, because that's something that can only be at the benefit of your radical anti-system opposition, rather than the missile itself. And here, the discussion climate is enormously tense. And I even hate to open Twitter, because the only thing that you get is people going after the throat in each other, and some people are completely parroting nonsense, and you feel like a myth buster on this platform. I hope that the British swap deal will kind of enable this, because on the other hand, Ukraine has a clear desire to continue strikes against the Russian Black Sea Fleet, because that keeps the grain corridor open. The grain corridor provides foreign currency, it keeps grain prices stabilized. So there is a very rationale for why they need more ammunition. The thing is, does it have to be a German ammunition? Can't you do that easier or cheaper with another? And if the Brits, for example, the Germans, have a competitive advantage in producing fighting vehicles, which the British don't do on that scale. So if you want to specialize, then it would be better if the British invest more into providing cruise missiles and we invest more in providing tanks. But yeah, it's an emotional debate right now, and emotional debates are always...
Je prends les deux dernières questions. Il y a monsieur qui est posé.
Two final questions. You, sir, Isabelle. Any questions online, Henri? Please, sir, go ahead. Good evening. You told us about a protracted conflict, but do you think that there would be more chance of troops on the ground coming from other countries? Ms. Guggenheim. I have a question that will take us back to the beginning of this round of lectures. General Burkhardt, the Chief of Staff of the Joint Chief of Staff, said that the decision-making is on the ground. We get the impression that Ukraine is more responsive, but Russia has more means. I was touched to see that in spite of the propaganda, there were thousands of people that went out in the street to pay tribute to Navalny. So at least they had the information. But there's the war of information in this conflict, and information tends to be the casualty of war. Thank you, Gustave. What would you say to that?
So on sort of the future progress, how to deal with the stalemate, there's basically a distinction between the Ukrainian approach and the Russian approach. The Russian approach is to increase, and it's very Soviet army thinking, to increase the mass of your assaults to the point the other line breaks. And if you haven't found the right ratio of mass, then you just increase it. The problem for Russia is the longer the war goes, the more problematic it will be to provide the mass, because now they are in the complete heyday of producing and refurbishing vehicles. And for the Russian side, vehicles are short in supply. People are not, but vehicles and combat systems are short in supply. The Ukrainian approach is to refine tactics, to improve synchronization of forces, to invent new procedures. They have had very high hopes that the troops trained in the West for the counteroffensive with Western training would bring the magical breakthrough. Well, part of what they realize is that the training in the West helps so far as to familiarize Ukrainian soldiers with Western equipment, but does not forge cohesive units, battalions, brigades. From different soldiers, one is trained on a tank here in Germany and the other one on an infantry fighting vehicle here in Britain, and others here in Poland, etc. They don't behave cohesively. The second thing is that I've clearly realized that NATO's understanding, our forces' understanding of a conventional war against a peer competitor, another big army, is basically Fulda Gap 1985. And Zaporizhzhia Oblast in 2023 was not Fulda in 1985. Technology has progressed. The means of warfare have progressed. Even if you fight on predominantly old vehicles, you use modern drones, modern electronic warfare system beside them. So you need to refine, you need to reconceptualize how you do the whole thing. And this is also something that in Ukraine needs time to mature, because they know what does not work. They haven't figured out what really works. They have some ideas and some prospects in improving that, but it's a work in progress and it will need time. Navalny, yes, it was very encouraging to see all these people coming out. The problem is that Russia, the Russian regime, does not allow these people who have a different opinion to organize properly. And opposition to take place would need an organization. Now, does this mean there is absolutely no chance of change in Russia? I wouldn't think so. For example, if we spin back to World War I, the Tsarist army had a similar policy on financially supporting families that had their husbands and kids sent to war and mobilized. This provided, especially for rural regions in the Tsarist Empire, an unprecedented inflow of cash. Suddenly, families that had never a real independent financial income had one. Especially the premiums for fallen soldiers to the widows were substantial and should ensure that these widows had a continuous life that was not in poverty. So that was the idea. And it's roughly similar what the Russians do now. And the financial incentives is the primary motivation for people to sign up. Now, what happened in Russia? 1916, we had the Brusilov offensive. And while the Brusilov offensive was militarily quite successful and almost caused the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian army and made us dependent on the Prussians, financially it was a disaster, because the high casualties led to all the premiums for the widows to be paid at once. And it introduced so much cash into the Tsarist Empire that had no equivalent in terms of, you couldn't buy anything for this anymore because there was no civilian consumer good market. You could invest, you suddenly have a lot of money and nothing to do with it. So what does such a situation lead to? You have heated inflation. Because at the same time, because this money went to the rural grounds, then the workers of the arms factories started to demand increased salary. And we have now the same thing. You have a lot of defense companies in Russia that have vacancies in the thousands because they can't find the skilled workers. And they have to increase their salaries for people to work in the defense industry, and they need workers to crank out the stuff they need, but they need to compete against the high salaries in the armed forces. And that again drives, and there is a shrinking consumer market. And this inflation shock paved the way for the double revolution in 1917. The problem, of course, is if you draw the parallel that a lot of people in the West automatically expect that in 2 years from now, revolution in Russia will happen. And history is never that apodictic. There are signs of overheating in the Russian economy. There are signs of discontent. Whether they will overlap and produce something like a revolution might be, I hope it will, but it is not something you can take for granted. Hence, I try not to speak about it because it gives politicians the comfort to do nothing and hope that the problem will solve itself, which is a very European way of thinking about problems. But usually it doesn't happen. Troops on the ground for the foreseeable time now. There are indeed discussions on sending soldiers, but they're not in a way that you sort of ponder about sending a combat brigade. Discussions revolve, for example, around trainers. Experienced officers, they go to Ukraine and look at Ukrainian training schemes and their training centers and advise them what to do better, etc. Because Ukraine has a huge training need, and they have increased their army on a huge scale. The problem is you can find the soldiers for it, but you don't find the officers. Also, the problem in Ukraine is you have a stock of officers that is well trained, that has combat experience in the Donbass, that have been retrained to more modern principles of war and modern leadership techniques, but there are very few. Most of the officers you kind of mobilized are people that had a very Soviet military education that is not up to time. To cure that, you can send specialists. The second issue is military medicine, and especially treating and specialists detecting the use of chemical weapons. There is a suspect that Russians are actually using chemical weapons on the front quite widespread, but the problem is there's insufficient Ukrainian capacity to really detect what it is and to prove it. The specialists that can do that for chemical weapons that are fairly modern are all in military hands, so you would have to send officers. There's no contractor that can do that for you. Now, these are, of course, boots on the ground, but it's not the kind of the way the discussion goes. And here I'm generally quite happy about Macron these days, but I think this discussion was the wrong thing at the wrong time that gave the wrong impression. There is, of course, a merit to keep the Russians guessing. We shouldn't always tell the Russians what we are not going to do. He's very right on that. But on the other hand, the domestic support for weapons for Ukraine in many countries rest on the assumptions we support Ukraine with all means but direct boots on the ground. And the moment you introduce that moment in a debate where you actually don't clarify yourself what you mean, you create a lot of discomfort and actually shy away people from supporting Ukraine that otherwise would. I'm not too familiar with the French debate, domestic debate, but in Germany it had the opposite effect. It basically consolidated the support for the kind of, I don't want to call them peace camp because it's not peace what they want, but the kind of withdrawal and isolationism camp. So this is something with the messaging one has to have in mind.
Merci beaucoup, Gustav Gressel.
Thank you so much, Gustav. I would like to thank our interpreters who've been with us. We have Robert Wolfenstein and Anthony Roger. Give them both a round of applause. We'll see you next Monday, Rose Gottmüller, for the final lecture of this round of lectures. Thank you.